So, for those who don't know me, I'm Deborah Donnelly. I'm the executive director here at Alberta Wilderness Association. I've been here 15 months. 15 months. Yeah, some days. So welcome to Hillhurst Cottage School. For those that you don't know, this is a historic place of Canada. It was a schoolhouse, a primary schoolhouse, and is a heritage site. I apologize that there's no parking available at the moment because we are doing some construction work on our foundation. So unfortunately, our construction is taking up all of the parking. So I hope no one had any troubles finding parking or they used transit tonight. Washroom is here, the lights on the outside, just as housekeeping. But I'm so pleased to see so many people here tonight. I think this is the most people we've had at an event since COVID. So well done. Thank you. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our guest this evening. Lorne is an amazing writer who sends articles to us almost on a weekly basis. I don't know how anyone is such a prolific writer, but I guess it has to deal with his passion. He has been a professional biologist for over 40 years, primarily in Alberta. And he's a previous recipient of both the Alberta Emerald Award and Wilderness Defender. Back in 2012, he was AWA's Wilderness Defender. And so, you know, he has a long relationship with AWA that I'm very proud to say that we're still continuing with. He also contributes quite frequently to our quarterly journal, The Wildlands Advocate, which you get when you're a member. And if you're not a member, please become a member. And there's a membership drive on right now. So if you become a member, you also get a free copy of the hiking guide. So think about that. Christmas present. Yes, great Christmas present. And today is Giving Tuesday. So streams, I'm going to read a little bit from the review I did on Lorne's book. Amy Tucker, our outreach and communications person, also did a review. So if you're interested, you can see those reviews on our website. But Streams of Consequence, which is this lovely book of Lorne's, is a compendium of stories about the wildlife and wild places of Alberta. I'm going to put my reading glasses told through the lens of an experienced biologist who grew up on this land. This is not a typical science book, but an insightful and thought-provoking compilation of essays interspersed with humor and relatable examples. Lorne's ability to weave topics into interesting tales is well known to many in Alberta. I'm sure many of you here in this room know Lorne or his reputation. He is a ubiquitous friend of the environment, and his cheeky, jam-filled expressions sum up the generational amnesia present in the economic biases of industry and the Alberta government. So please welcome Lorne Fitch.
Introduction, I'm tempted to just stand here and let you gaze at me in awe. I said to my wife Cheryl that I would view this book as a success if both my friends bought a copy. And here you are. What the rest of you are doing here, I don't know. I think we're all here because of the Alberta Wilderness Association, an organization that's been informing, engaging, asking the hard questions, and consistently representing the wild and wild things. The AWA and like-minded organizations are an essential ingredient if we're to retain any part of the wild and wild things in this province. As Deborah said, I've been fortunate to provide articles to the Wildland Advocate for years, starting with Cindy Smith when she was the editor. And I don't know when that was. It was the old black and white version of the Wildlands Advocate. Some of you may not remember that. You don't have the hair color to come back that far. And then there was Joe Hildebrand. Joe, some 15 years ago, Joe suggested I should write a book. Joe, here it is. I know it's a little late. And Shirley Gray followed along with the inclusion of my articles. And then Ian Urquhart and Philip Meisner and now Amy Tucker. And I really thank AWA for the opportunity to give me some space for some of my concerns about this province and what this province is turning into. I'm going to talk a little bit about writing a book before I give you a reading. A book does not spring forth fully formed. It develops organically with the help and suggestions of many. One of my sources is my wife, Cheryl Bradley, who's my fiercest critic and most ardent supporter. Many of you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the messages sent out into the social ether advising of this get-together. So thank you for that. Think about this. When you read a book, you engage in a down payment of time in which to wallow in the contents. If you enjoy the read, it wasn't wasted time or money. A book encloses the amber of a moment, an essential fragment to which you can devote a few minutes to ponder. Unlike a conversation or this speech, where the words go winging past you, sometimes faster than you're able to assimilate them, passages in a book sit there, allowing you time to absorb, contemplate, and then move on. That book is the content, the contact, the interface for greater awareness, understanding, and knowledge. It could also include empathy, humility, joy, and sorrow amid changing your perspective or supporting it. You can be entertained, laugh, cry, or become angry. I hope this book accomplishes some of those goals. Since writing has the unique quality of arresting time for a moment and having us pay attention, because attention is what's required if we want to save ourselves and the things we hold dear. Writing it was easy. All that was required was opening up a vein in my arm and letting the content pour out on the pages. You think that's just metaphorical. There is no artificial intelligence in this book, only scar tissue. Sometimes experiences are so agonizing when you keep them bottled up inside, and it was cathartic to write them down. Barbara Kingsolver said writing was both painful and palliative and lasts longer than most other pain relievers. For me, it's meant, in many cases, waking up to a tangle of thoughts, generally at 3 a.m., spiraling around work-related insomnia. Writing them down unlocked the thought vortex and allowed me to get back to sleep. Across years of study and work, of small successes and slow failures, of brief delights and long irritations, I have come to some conclusions about being a biologist. One is, as Yeats observed about the Irish, we have an abiding sense of tragedy which sustains us through temporary periods of joy. Maybe some of you have sleepless nights too, suffering from eco-anxiety or eco-grief. Perhaps it's a feeling that you just can't put your finger on, understand, or see relief from. I hope some of my essays help you articulate your feelings, a step towards resolution. Or maybe reading this book will cause you to have sleepless nights. I will apologize, but not repent. Then there are some that deserve to have a few sleepless nights, but they likely will not read this book. One of the reasons I wrote this book was to give a voice to many who have no voice, or whose voices are muted, like biologists working for government, corporations, or consulting firms. Many people with strong conservation convictions may lack the words, the concepts, to successfully argue for protection and stewardship of our watersheds, landscapes, and critters. I hope my words help you. Aldo Leopold's words have helped me. I have forgotten how many times I have read his epic, A Sand County Almanac. Each time I pick it up, I'm attracted to passages I had previously underlined. They jump out at me as fundamental truths, exquisite explanations, and timely interjections. If something in my writing causes you to stop, ponder, and maybe underline the passage, I would view this as a hopeful sign that my words spoke to you. You won't be defacing the book, only accentuating parts of it for further reference. In an arena of mumbles, muddled thinking, inflated self and corporate interest, prevarication, and sometimes downright dishonesty, we need some truth-telling. Telling the truth, providing a clear, transparent, objective view of land use and landscapes is a significant ray at the end of the conservation tunnel. It's one of the few tests of sustainability. Where others would add more tunnel to disguise the impacts, it's important to shine the bright light of neutral science down the tunnel on issues of immense concern. We can bang and bang on the door of hope that a rational, reasonable approach to our environmental issues will occur. A colleague of mine wisely says, hope is a verb with its sleeves. I write to suggest the feeling that no one's home can only be navigated by holding on to the stories that provide us new kinds of truth. Some days you have to work hard to save a river, a forest, or a crocus. Some days the river, the forest, and the crocus will save you. My wide-ranging experience and insights on conservation in Alberta now go back 5 decades. I've been in the trade long enough to be able to look back on the changes, weigh their significance, and write about where we've come from, where we're at, and where the trend will take us if we choose one road or another. I hope there's some appetite amongst Albertans and others to understand the ecological crossroads we're at and what needs to be done to retain our wild heritage. We learned in physics that the world is composed of atoms. True enough, but what binds the world together are stories. Stories talk about places, how places affect us, and how we affect places. So I'd like to engage first with you on a story of strawberry jam. And perhaps for you that are a literary background, you might recognize allegory. So the title of the piece is When the Strawberry Jam Boom Went Bust. And this is, it's in honor of my mother-in-law, who unfortunately passed away this spring. I'm going through a bit of a recession, maybe even verging on a depression. It has to do with strawberry jam, not the markets. My mother-in-law, who has made arguably the best strawberry jam wherever in the world there are strawberries, has stopped cooking this fruity elixir. This represents a serious downturn for me, a jam crunch. She has her reasons, age and energy. I bear her no malice for the cessation of picking, cleaning, slicing, cooking, and canning, There are better things to do on the hottest day of the year. This was the underpinning, the substance that signaled the soundness of my breakfast world. The glue that held my breakfast together is missing. It has come to an end. If not collapsed, my world is echoing with the sound of a spoon in an empty jar. No more coming back from southern Ontario with jars of it. No more well-wrapped jars arriving at Christmas. No more jammy care packages delivered by Eastern family members to the poor, deprived Westerners. Our cupboards used to run over, our larder groaning under the accumulated weight. Jars of it piled up, engulfing us faster than we could engulf the contents. Jars of it matured on our shelves, developing their unique bouquets, coalescing into a whole that was greater than the parts. We would ponder whether to open a bottle of the 97, a robust fruity number, or throw caution to the wind and open the latest offerings. Jam would be shared with our friends. Sometimes we would push it like some illicit substance that was rumored to take you to another dimension. To our friends, most of whom grew up in the 60s, this was too much to resist. Indeed, the bountiful surplus of strawberry jam was too much for me to resist. How did I treat this cornucopia of jam? Sadly, my response was tinged with sarcasm, derision, and thoughtlessness. We've been bequeathed a lifetime supply of jam, I often opined to my wife, comparing the accumulated jars to some family legacy or inheritance. More jam, I would exclaim with less than enthusiasm at the opening of a parcel containing, wait for it, more jam. A clearance sale of jam, I would joke, we're jammed up in the warehouse. Callous, empty, stupid words. Profligate use has emptied the cupboard and the shelves are bare. The strawberry jam train has long left the station. Not even the residual stickiness is left. All that sticks is the distant memory of that last precious jar. A mood of despair, of longing, and of trepidation for the future has set in. Because foresight isn't an option anymore, I've been beating myself up with hindsight. Why didn't I extol the virtues of her jam to my mother-in-law? Why didn't I appear more appreciative of her loving labors? And why didn't I encourage her in the continued manufacture of that ambrosia? The Chinese axiom that every banquet comes to an end never resonated when ladling that sweet concoction of berries onto toast. Sooner or later, everyone sits down to a banquet of consequences, said Robert Louis Stevenson, the 19th century author of Treasure Island. He would not have known of my mother-in-law's strawberry jam. If he had, he surely would have identified it as a substance worthy of the title of treasure. But I did not, regrettably. My banquet is set, and it is void of strawberry jam. If only I'd saved more, meted it out with a sense of conservation, been more judicious in sharing it, or thought about how to make the supply last longer. But I didn't. In my blindness, I thought the largesse would be endless. I thought the strawberry jam frontier would never end. The strawberry jam resource was, in my mind, unplumbed in its depth. The signals were there, of course, but I ignored them. Any distant early warning suggestion of showing restraint, of considering future jam eaters, or of gaining self-sufficiency in the jam department were met with disdainful dismissal. If I could just have one more chance, get one more jar, I promise I'll cherish it. I'll never again consume strawberry jam like a pig at a trough. I will think about tomorrow and about the limited supply of that truly rare, valuable commodity. I'll take care not to overuse this precious natural resource with careless disdain for the consequences. I'll steward this bequest with love and respect. You may be on a different jam trajectory, one where you have time to evaluate and reassess your consumption. It's too late now for me to make amends, to turn back the hands of time and watch the jam jars magically refill. I know now I took things for granted when the jam economy was booming. For the love of jam, consider a change. Sit down with your jam maker, learn the craft, grasp the jam torch and make sure it stays lit. Never forget how precious those jars of canned sunshine, rain, and love are. I know I'll never take my mother-in-law's strawberry jam for granted again. One more? That's you. I want people to buy this book because the proceeds go to the AWA, and it would be unfair to read these all out and rob the AWA.
Observation.
Gotta set the bait.
So this is a rather non-controversial piece called Tracks and Spoor. Golden yellow aspen leaves quietly rustle in the Porcupine Hills. The noise of summer motors no longer overwhelms the breath of wind caressing the ancient Douglas firs. Emerson wrote, "Let us be silent that we might hear the whispers of the gods." The motorized set has either not heard or not understood the message, drowned out as it is in the screaming of fossil-fueled piston action. Perhaps the gods of off-highway vehicle users have to shout to be heard. Today, on a glorious autumn day, it is Emerson's gods, the ones with soft, subtle voices, who are speaking. They remind me that I'm in a place named by the Blackfoot for the outline of trees on the ridgetops, set against an improbably big sky at the edge of endless grassland. The Porcupine Hills must have appeared like a welcome antidote to the grassland, where at times it seems like there's nothing to lean your eyes on. I have the labyrinth of trails to myself, unlike in the summer, and I find myself paying close attention to the stories engraved in this landscape. This thought pattern becomes a trap, and instead of just looking and enjoying the subtle shifts of emphasis, I start to ponder what I observe. Colin Fletcher, the Welsh-born voice of hikers, wrote, "In beautiful places, thought can be an impediment to pleasure." But it's too late for subtle appreciation as I try to make sense of the pair of women's panties beside the trail, and a few feet later, a pair of men's underwear. Modesty prevents me from providing further description of these underpinnings, especially size, but I would characterize them as ample. I'm not a competent enough tracker to read whether one set of underwear was meant as bait or as a signal for the other. Perhaps it was a case of one merely reacting to the other, or a spontaneous gesture by both. I'm on a well-used OHV trail, and as the OHV people like to point out, this is a family sport. I just didn't realize conception on trail side was part of adding erection to the cycle of traction, compaction, erosion, and sedimentation. Maybe those of us who use their natural quads for backcountry travel are missing something. Do the vibrations, pounding, tension, and torsion, plus the harmonic engine whine induce a hypnotic state that excites passion and brings out naked trailside lust? Is it all mixed up in display, with mud gripper tires shooting up a rooster tail of dirt and rocks to indicate fitness to breed? Part of the ritual must be the ability to explore new horizons by carving deep ruts in the steep slopes. Prospective mates must discern this activity is an indication of superior foraging ability. Maybe it's the rhythmic booming farting exhaust, a primitive tribal drum call for the elaborate mating ceremony. That's what I'm thinking while observing the spoor of summer motorheads. But it's difficult to stalk the elusive OHV user to understand their rituals. Maybe these artifacts weren't part of a mating ritual, the dance with no pants, but instead an alternate headgear to filter dust from a busy trail. All the trails I walk on are layered in dust. It puffs up under my boots. At speed, a pack of quads or trail bikes must blot the scenery out completely. The trails I walk on are rutted, in some places ground down to bedrock. Spinning wheels have advanced the rate of geological weathering and speeded up erosion far beyond the natural scale. I do some cross-sectional measurements of trail sections to see how far down motorized traffic has worn them. My back of the envelope calculations shock me. On nearly flat to moderate slopes, for every 4 paces, up to a half a ton of soil is eroded away. On steeper slopes, approximately a ton of soil is slipped down slope, again every 4 paces. Occasional mini Grand Canyons have formed on the very steep hillsides where water has finished the job begun by spinning tires. Down to bedrock and unnavigable, even by OHVs, new trails now parallel those tank traps, hastening the eventual widening of the canyons. One of the trails extends from the road in the valley bottom to the ridge top about 1.5 kilometers. For a trail that rarely exceeds 1 meter in width, something approximating 300 tons of soil has eroded away. If this were farmland, the rate of erosion would galvanize action to stop it. And this is just one of myriad of trails crisscrossing the Porcupine Hills. Unknowingly, people driving on these trails have created a perfect storm of erosion in the Porcupine Hills. Every trail, every rut is a conduit, a straight line feature that captures water from snowmelt and rainfall. These linear trails are an efficient interception and collection system, hastening the rush of water down slope. In their efficiency is the problem. To decrease erosion, a watershed needs water to move slowly at a constrained pace hindered and thwarted by vegetation. That way, the speed of moving water and erosive force is reduced and more of it seeps into the soil, creating a reservoir of water for drier periods. Like slow food, we need slow runoff. Gravity is a formidable force, and the soil loosened by tires and aided by runoff waters finds its way downhill. Beneath me, in the valley bottom, is Beaver Creek. One doesn't have to connect many dots to imagine where all the soil eroding from the trails is heading. But I suppose someone without enough sense to pick up their underwear from beside the trail probably hasn't grasped the simplest principles of hydrology, like water runs downhill, or erosion. Bare soil, like a bare bottom, moves. Just because we have technology doesn't mean we have wisdom. Beaver Creek, once a stream that babbled along over gravel with water clear enough to see the bottom, muddles through banks of mud, the result of former hill slopes brought low by incessant tire action. The creek, tiny at best, struggles with this undue load of sediment, equivalent to an incredibly long line of trucks with tandem loads of dirt toiling up to dump all of it into the waters of Beaver Creek. And that happens every year, year after year. Researchers have found sediment runoff from OHV activity to be 2 to 20 times higher than the runoff rate from undisturbed ground, depending on slope, precipitation, and intensity of vehicle use. Insidiously, cumulatively, this sediment pours off bare slopes and down rutted trails past the passerby, most of whom are oblivious to the phenomenon. Imagine the reaction if you brought just one truckload of dirt up to Beaver Creek and dumped it in the water. You'd risk prosecution under a number of federal and provincial statutes. If someone from the Beaver Creek Watershed Group caught you, there might be some old-fashioned Western justice meted out, the type that involves no courtrooms and no lawyers. I don't actually think the ranchers of the Beaver Creek Watershed Group would engage in vigilante justice, but it must be frustrating, even infuriating, to have worked for nearly a decade on restoration and improved management of their lands, only to look upstream and see the public land, the forest reserve, treated so badly. When the upstream owner is the Alberta government, wouldn't you think that a stewardship ethic would be present and that there would be attempts to manage land uses to prevent excessive erosion? That's a rhetorical question. The Porcupine Hills are dangerously close to turning into a piston head racetrack and obstacle course with industrial overtones of petroleum development and clear-cut logging. It's happened over time with the acquiescence of the land manager, the Alberta government. It's classic benign neglect. Before this landscape disappears completely in a pall of dust and is swallowed up by vehicle ruts, before the streams become paved with mud, some reflection and rethinking are necessary. Like the couple responding to stimuli on trailside, leaving their underwear behind, OHV users have responded to a void in resource management in our forest reserves. This has proliferated beyond the capacity of the land to absorb such use. Aldo Leopold explained the issue of roads and trails and OHVs, although that was much before his time, with the metaphor of the pig in the parlor. He elaborated in 1925, roads and wilderness are merely a case of the pig in the parlor. We now recognize that the pig is all right for bacon, which we all eat. But there is no doubt there was a time, soon after the discovery that many pigs meant much bacon, when our ancestors assumed that because the pig was so useful an institution, he should be welcomed at all times and all places. I suppose that the first enthusiast who raised the question of limiting his distribution was construed to be uneconomic, visionary, and anti-pig. Like Leopold's pigs, we can have too many trails and too many OHVs on them. Caring for the Porcupine Hills should take us back to basics. First, we need to protect the watershed, a priority higher than anything else. We can accomplish this by first restoring, then maintaining a healthy landscape, one that is resilient to erosion, traps moisture, and is composed of native plants. That goes a long way towards securing habitat for fish and wildlife. Caring means we have to reverse the syndrome of detachment and denial, where people who foul and despoil wildernesses do not think of how their activity affects the natural world or anyone else. As we secure the physical place, we must also secure the place for it in our minds, maybe our hearts. At the end of a Sand County Almanac, Leopold writes, recreational development is a job not of building roads into lovely country, but of building receptivity into the still unlovely human mind. We need an old growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of empathy, and a landscape of understanding. In that place, there needs to be respect for and awareness of the natural world, as well as a sense of limits. We can create that place where peace and quiet provides an antidote to our otherwise busy, noisy lives. There, we might experience the natural world and all of its treasures, benefits, and glories, as will future generations of enlightened citizens. We will hear the whispers of the gods, and our footprint will be fleeting and light. Thank you. I've been asked to answer some questions, and the answer is yes. Well, having heard none. Linda.
Tell us about the fun parts of creating the book. Or some fun part.
Fun.
Strange.
Well, I think one of the things, sure, I would characterize it as fun, but determining different ways to convey messages to people so that instead of turning aside from a standard environmental rant, they actually got long enough into the story that they actually learned something. Strawberry jam is an example of that. You know, at the end, you've got to be struck by the fact this isn't about strawberry jam. And you think to yourself, oh crap, I learned something. I think that's.
Thanks.
But
Yeah, a bugbear of mine has been wildlife biologists that oppose legislating anything. Has your thought on that evolved over time? Because building receptivity into the human mind is too slow, in my opinion. And so how do we get there? You know, the storytelling helps, all of this helps, but to save the planet, you gotta put some rules in place.
could you ask an easy question first?
But I just wonder why the opposition to that regulation in the first place.
Cliff raises a good question, and I'm not so sure that it's often amongst the profession as it is amongst the people who direct the profession, the bureaucrats, the politicians. Legislation is it can provide constraints, as we all know. It can provide speed limits on highways. I mean, what kind of a world would it be if we had speed limits on highways? And so, you know, this is one of the things that I think keeps us from defining what it is we actually want, what it is we need, and using the articles of science to define things like ecological thresholds and limits and cumulative effects. I suspect that that's part of it. And to your point, and it's a good one, Cliff, about, you know, do we have the time to introduce receptivity in the unlovely human mind?
Oh, it's lovely.
I don't know, but I guess my response is it's what I can do. I can write, you know, I can provide people alternate perspectives. I can be angry, I can be joyful, and that's my opportunity to do that. Others have to choose what their choice is going to be to make a difference in the world. Yes.
Have you got any examples of seeing children who are so tuned into the technosphere, like transition from that really isolated world into embracing the biosphere, like going from this is how I'm going to get my information to, oh wow, this such a different experience when they're exposed to.
Funny you should ask that question, because Cheryl and I hosted 2 grandnieces this summer, 2 teenage girls. Actually, we asked people, how do you entertain teenage girls? Most of the answers were, oh. But it's difficult to separate them from their handheld devices. Although they had a sweatshirt that on the back said, disconnect to connect. Irony is wasted on teenagers. trail and I took them through a series of landscapes in southern Alberta. And maybe Cheryl can jump in, but I think we noticed that there was maybe a subtle shift in looking at their handheld devices and actually looking at the landscape and being moved by the landscape. And so some of it, I think, is putting those kids into the place where they can be amazed by what's out there rather than in here. Other than that, I have no idea what to do with children. Yes, Greg.
You know, I was thinking that those of us that have read your book, and clearly we're waiting for the second one, and maybe in light of that last great question, streams of consequences, maybe the next book could be the consequences of streaming.
Well, here, thanks, Brad. I didn't plan this. The title of the next book, I'm gonna test this on you. Because the publisher has already accepted it for printing next fall.
Come back to AWA for.
The title is Up the Creek. An ecological pilgrimage in search of a paddle. Does that work?
I was gonna ask if fair, follow up on Cliff, is, and you've been watching this dynamic in terms of natural capital at scale of Alberta, Canada, you show travel the world. When you kind of fall asleep at night, how long-winded do you think we have at kind of different spatial scales before the opportunity to adjust that mindset is largely gone?
Well, one of the reasons I can't fall asleep at night is that most of the wildlife in the world has disappeared in my lifespan. So this is not history, this is imminent. So when we look at something pretty close to home, like the contents of this glass, and what we're seeing over the span of this season, and what we're heading into, a product of climate change, is we have an impending water crisis. That's in real time. It's not history. And I think the bigger question, Brad, isn't how much time we have, but are we even preparing for it? And for example, I don't think that our current government, I mean, they're incoherently reluctant to speak about the imminent water crisis that we have. And it isn't so much imminent, we're actually in a water crisis. So I'm not a professional modeler like you, so I can't come up with an exact number. But I think we have very short time left to turn some of this stuff around. And the question of, will we turn it around? It's going to be largely based on awareness and a more learned public that understands the risk that's inherent in our lives if we do nothing, which we're currently doing. Actually, we're doing worse than nothing.
So, do you have any sense of, or maybe I have a misplaced sense of optimism? In fact, in the 20-year-old, in anybody younger than about 32 or 33, amongst our children, they either have an immense sense of despair, or they're ready to soldier. And I mean, I'm wondering what your sense is. People who are 35 and older are useless.
Company accepted. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I must admit, one of the things that a good friend of mine, after having read much of my material, once asked me, and it wasn't in a critical way, it was more of a conversational way. You write anything positive? And it reminded me of a conversation I had with another colleague, a university professor, who finally said, or observed that he couldn't actually speak of a lot of these environmental issues because he could see the eyes glaze over in his students. It was just too much. And so, you know, is there, I think what you're asking is there hope? And does that hope exist in the,
And how do you touch it?
yeah, well, I'm gonna say that's the only place that hope exists. Because, and present company accepted, our generation hasn't done a sterling job. And so, the next generation or the next generations will have to. And I think sometimes it's, you have to be scared spitless before you actually realize you've got to make a change. You've got to be standing on the abyss, looking down into it. And if the younger generation, and I see, I mean, all of the AWA specialists are in that category, and I haven't seen them run shrieking from the room, so it gives me hope that they realize the issues that we face.
I told them they had to stay.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right, so it's imposed, so. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, just a minute, yep.
I am scared and in staring into the abyss. I'm working on opposing the planned clear cut of the upper highway getting next to the sawmill. And, yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions of, how to organize, concerned citizens around that.
It's a question that comes up, actually, it came up in another book reading I did just recently. And I think, and no criticism of the tactics being used to delay or change the perspective on the highwood logging, but oftentimes we are too late. If you think about the way that forest management happens, a lot of those decisions are baked in 20 years ago. A time where there is no opportunity for public input. The only time for public input is when logging is imminent. And they need to put that check mark on the box that says, did we involve the public? So, and I'm not suggesting that we write off the highway, but I would suggest that our better option is to start looking forward to 20 years to where the next clear cut is going to be, or 10 years, and put our effort into that. And also recognizing that despite the fact that there is a lot of great science out there that would help us develop more sustainable logging practices, it is not being used because the driver is economics, not ecology. And so I think that that's one of the things that we need to do is scour the literature, make sure that not only government, but the timber companies know what the current science is and force them to follow it. That's the only way we're going to get to, I think, to a more sustainable level of timber harvest in our eastern slopes. And I know that isn't an answer for the highwood, at least it isn't right now, but we've got to prepare better for the future rather than having rear guard actions just as the skidders are being unloaded. Yes.
Hey, Lorne, nice to see you again after a lot of years.
Good to see you.
Congratulations on close to 5 decades on the battlefront, I would say.
A lot of scar tissue.
And I was thinking about that a few times in my life, I guess. I got a bit of gray hair too. And at times I get really tired. And matter of fact, I've kind of backed off from being on the front line like I worked with you a number of years ago. And I'm wondering if you have any particular ways you re-energize yourselves. We're hearing a lot in the news about doctors and nurses, a bunch of professionals. They're burning out. What do you call it? So what do you do personally? Keep yourself fighting.
could put my psychiatrist hat on for a minute here, but I don't have one. I can only tell you what I do. I write. That helps me with the anger. That helps me with the frustration. That helps me develop a perspective about things. And hopefully, if you all buy a book tonight and enrich the AWA, it will give you that opportunity. Was that enough of a plug there? Yeah, I think each one of us has to find ways of coping with this. And it's not yelling at the TV. That's momentarily satisfactory, but it doesn't solve anything. And I think the key is we have to pick coping mechanisms that actually solve something.
Are you spending enough time in the forest, wading in the streams? I don't know.
Yes, that's where I get my inspiration. That's Cheryl and I have some land southwest of Pincher, and a great deal of inspiration for my writing comes from sitting on the porch watching the world go by. I know that sounds like old people's talk, but it's a great place to refresh and to get away from the constant stream on social media. Not that I'm on social media, but on of email of the next tragedy, the next environmental tragedy that's happening. And
McClellan.
sit back. Sorry.
McClellan.
Yes, McClellan. Yes. Yes.
I have a question from someone on Zoom. So can you speak on the debates within conservation of protectionism versus new conservation, on preserving wilderness versus working with the economy to transform our ideas of nature in order to keep what we have? Do you think this debate is valuable or taking away from the actual issues?
That's, to the listener, that's a deer caught in the headlights look. I'm not, seriously, I'm not even sure where to begin with that. I know that there is a constant dichotomy between the environment and the economy. And I write about it in one of the essays entitled Balance. And I think, you know, there's always this thing, we've got to achieve balance. You know, you hear it from the oil and gas industry, we've got to achieve balance, which means we've got to keep pumping stuff into the air. The timber industry says we've got to achieve balance, but we've got to cut that old growth timber. And the OHV community says we've got to achieve balance, but we just got to drive over all of it. And so I think we've been sucked into this thing called balance, you know, which is the dichotomy between the economy and the environment. Not recognizing that after 85 or 90% of the world is used up, we can't achieve balance in the last 15%. It just doesn't work. And so I think that has to be part of the discussion in answer to this question, is that how much is left to achieve this magical balance on, and is it actually realistic to do so?
Thanks.
I'll close my eyes.
I kind of like your jam analogy. I lost my first favorite jam about 60 years ago. In those days, my losses of preserves, they were small places. They got bigger and took longer, and now it takes little time to make a great big thing start to disappear. And, you know, wherever I go, it's happening. Even the people that love the jam are ruining it. There's too many of us, like the jam in some cases, you know, and again, it's not a question, but it's hard to motivate yourself to fight it sometimes. And it's so clear cut what has to be done, and it's not a pun that I wanted to make. But there's nobody in the government making it right now.
Yeah, Cleve has made a good point, is that even those of us that love the jam, love the landscape, we're still using up parts of it. And as we educate more people about how to enjoy the landscape, they use up more of it, and on it goes. Inevitably, I think we have to come to the realization, like the AWA came to with this room, it will only hold so many. And it doesn't matter who you know, you don't get through the door if there's no seat for you. And I think that's the way we need to start treating our landscapes. And this is not wild-haired thinking. You know, US national parks, particularly some of the favorite rivers, you have to apply in a lottery to get a chance to float some of those rivers. You might only get a chance every 10 years. But the ones that do have a quality experience. And so I guess the question is then, what do we want? Do we want quantity experiences where everybody rushes down the river at the same time? Or do we want a quality one where you get to experience a wilderness trip on that river? And I think that's the choices that we're rapidly coming to. Maybe we've actually exceeded them in some cases. And when you see the cars parked on the side of the road in Kananaskis country in the summer, it begs the question, have we exceeded the capacity, the recreational carrying capacity of that landscape? Yes.
Yes, we talked a lot about, what we need to do in order to foster change. We need good science, you mentioned, and really good science. We need to know the science, but what about the legal part of it? I listened to the Judy Stewart presentation a month ago on gravel pits and the legislation of that. I think a big space right now too. How much, and I think First Nations at one point I've heard them say, we're not gonna talk anymore, we're just gonna go use the law, we're just gonna go to the courts. No use talking, we'll go work with the law, and I don't know whether we can use that kind of same approach for some of what we're trying to do, whether it's for the highwood, or whether it's for gravel mines, or other activity. I feel like I don't know enough about the environmental law, the legalities of that, but I should, because so often we're up against lawyers that understand a lot more than we do.
Great question. And I think there's two parts to it. One is McClellan might be an example. The highwood might be another. When you're forced to the edge, what's left? But a legal challenge. When reason, when science doesn't prevail, what's left? And I think that's the perfect opportunity to use those legal mechanisms. It may be the only opportunity we have to protect a place. The other side of the coin is, unless it's a private citizen's initiative to use the law, you can't depend on our current governments, provincial and federal. I am frustrated beyond belief that the federal agency that purportedly is the advocate for fish is missing in action virtually all of the time. I half-heartedly joke that the rapid response unit of DFO to look after environmental infractions has to come from Burlington, Ontario. What does that tell you about government's ability to employ the law? And so I think that's the conundrum, is that this should already be being done for us by those agencies that hold the law. If they don't hold the law, we don't really have a law, do we? It's just not practical. And so it becomes a private citizen's responsibility. And then the issue is, how are you going to fund it? And which ones are you going to pick? Because as any of you that have been through an environmental impact assessment or a hearing, it takes a considerable amount of money to get the talent together to be able to provide the evidence that the adjudicators on the board should hear. So I'm not. I hope I'm not sounding dismissive of the use of the law. I wish the law was actually being used for the intended purposes that most people in the Dominion of Canada and Alberta think it is, but it's not.
It's just that sometimes I think that we have great science, we bring the science forward, but then we get slaughtered by the lawyers. We just find a way to dismiss us because of 1 or 2 words that we're not using, so.
Yeah, having been in front of, or on some of those things and having a lawyer paint me as being a chronic bedwetter and somebody that failed grade 3, I understand what you're talking about.
Yes.
This is probably a rather naive point of view, but what I have seen on the trails with all these people on the motorcycles, for example, and trails that I used to walk on and that haven't been open to motorcycles. And what I know about who got elected in the last provincial election.
Who was that?
And it seems to be that the people who care about wilderness will always be outnumbered by the people who have one function that works for them, and that's always voting for the government that will do what they want. Or that will do nothing if that's what they want. And I mean, I am sorry to say, but we're kind of outnumbered.
I've never felt we're outnumbered, but there are more of them. There was a question. Phil.
Oh, sure. You mentioned this many times tonight, but if we think about the need for human activities and our economy to stay safely within science-based ecological limits, then I feel that that requires some form of conscious regulation or dare I say planning of human activities in some form of democratic way. But in a world where the free market is king, do you have any ideas or suggestions as to how to achieve the sort of mass change required to convince people that planning isn't always totalitarianism?
I'm gonna give you the deer in the headlights. I think the crux of it, Philip, and I'll deal with the totalitarianism in a minute. I think the crux of it is we have failed planning in Alberta. We have the legislation that enables us to do it, but we have lost the capacity and capability to plan. We used to have staff that were expert planners, land use planners, and successive right-wing governments got rid of that function. And until we build that function up again, I'm not sure that we're going to get at the questions of, should we be logging in the highway, as an example. And until we get there, I think we will be subject to that sort of economic drivers that don't want us to plan, or that are reluctant to have us plan because they recognize what planning will do. It will put constraints on their activities. It will put limits on it, just as it will put limits on us for our activities. But if the purpose of planning is to figure out what is the perfect balance on a landscape, that's the cost. And if we are not prepared to deal with that cost, then the thing will go down the drain. And that's what it's doing now. McClellan Lake, Highway, logging in the Ghost, logging the Old Man, irrigation expansion. You name the things that are going on. None of those is exemplary in terms of being good planning for landscape or for the landscape attributes beyond which go beyond the economic products that come off the landscape. Yes, John.
This fits right in, I think. Most of the environmental issues we deal with involve trade-offs. Yet the public discourse rarely talks about trade-offs. We've got an advocate for this and an advocate for that. And the general public never really understand the costs and benefits of the planning.
Yeah.
What's optimal.
Yeah.
How do we get people to think more about trade-offs rather than being an advocate for A or B?
I think it's in full cost accounting.
Yes, yeah.
I think it's, if we want A, which means we have to sacrifice some of B, what's the cost of that? Is it, greater sediment downstream that's gonna cost an urban center more to treat the water? Is it more flooding because we've changed the hydrology of the landscape? And that means that maybe some of us will suffer wet basements and maybe not be able to get an insurance company to cover that. Those are the sort of things that I think we desperately need in that. And I think economists could help us in that regard. Put some reality to these things, because otherwise it's, oh, you know, we're gonna employ, 300 people in the development of this mountaintop coal mine.
We've heard that recently.
Yeah, and we're gonna have 50 people, permanently employed, and all the stores in this little mountain village are gonna be just, hip deep in cash because of this. Well, sure. But that's for full cost accounting. Would give us a much better perspective. Is that real? And what's the cost, the real cost of doing that? I've just written a little piece, which unfortunately the post media papers wouldn't publish, on how much did that 2x4 really cost? Because there's a price, but there's a cost. And if we knew the cost, then I think we all would be much better able to make a rational decision about whether that activity is reasonable or not. Yes, Lindsay.
So looking back over the AWA's history, I know you worked in government for many, many years.
I'm sorry.
I mean, just 20 years, I'm only 29, so. But back in sort of the early 70s, there were all these positive things and working with government and collaboration and so what do you think was it about that climate that made that possible? And why did that change? And is there some way that you see that we could get back to that place again?
Could I add regime change in?
We're non-partisan.
Lindsay is a very good question, because I started my career in 1971. And there was a period of time, and I don't know when it ended. I think it was probably near the end of the 80s, maybe early 1990s. It was actually a time when I, as a staff member, could interact with a minister and provide advice. There was a time when the research that we were doing, the monitoring that we were doing, was actually listened to. Now, the degree to which it was actually implemented is another thing, but at least there was an open dialogue happening. And at some point in time, and I think it started happening in the early 90s, and I think what it was the sort of progressive politicization of the civil service. When I started my career, the only political appointee in the civil service was the deputy minister. Now it goes right down to a director level. And so we have a completely different vibe, if you will, in the civil service, who are reacting endlessly at very low levels to these messages or these presumed dictates of the political level. And I think that's unhealthy. The civil service, I always understood my job was to provide advice to government. And it was their prerogative whether or not they took that advice. But it was provided and couched in terms that if you don't take it, there are some risks. Nobody provides the risks anymore. And so I think we got into this position where instead of speaking truth to power, which is what the civil service should do, it's yes, sir. How to change that? This is something that happened over a lot of years, and I've got a couple of my colleagues in the room that are the same ages as I am that can maybe speak to this as well. I think that has to reverse if we're ever going to get back to a place where the civil service, the advice of the civil service, is actually listened to and helps make decisions, as opposed to decisions being made at a political level without any information other than ideological. And the results are what we see today.
I think it's called decision-based evidence making.
Quite a phrase.
Do we really need that?
Funny, Cliff asked the question, do we really need evidence? Well, all of you put your seatbelts on when you drive, right? Why do you do that?
Evidence.
Evidence. Because if you're in a crash, there's a good chance you'll survive. And so we all base our decisions to one degree or another on evidence. And so it shouldn't be surprising that that's the way that we should make decisions about how our natural resources are managed. Yes.
In the underwear story.
You're back to that, are you?
I haven't left. Part of the later story is I hear is people have lost the connection between cause and effect.
Yes.
And it's that they don't know, or they're blind to it, or they don't care. And I'm not trying to get you to talk about all population.
I think it's bound up in this concept called shifting benchmarks. Those of us who have more or less polychromatic hair can remember a time in Alberta what the landscape was like. People today, when they head out to the forest reserve, I was in the Ghost watershed in September. I did a little sightseeing tour. And I was appalled. And what people see, they think is what's natural. That's the way it's always been. We see it as a steadily declining, deteriorating land base. But if you see it in fresh light as the only thing you think that's perfectly normal. And so you think, what are these people talking about? This landscape is perfect. Well, it isn't, but we've forgotten that because of this concept called shifting benchmarks. I think it's the same as in one of the presentations I do, and it's an example of the extent that I go to provide people information. I take a pie. I took a picture of it. That's 1850. We had the full pie. Turn of the century, 1900, little slice missing. Up to present time, there's only one little slice left. But when we come into the world, we think we have a full pie's worth of resources in front of us. We don't. We have one thin slice.
Or crumbs.
Or crumb, in some cases, yes. And so I think that's the issue that we need to talk about more. And that's why we need old people. Just making a case here. Who can remember what it used to be like? Yes.
Yeah, to build on that, there's conservation, which is like saving what's left, but, I, think about regeneration, how do we get the pie back?
Yeah, I don't think that saving what we've got is enough. If, for example, if that's the only recovery effort for native trout, they're toast. We actually have to rebuild a lot of the landscape if we want to restore functioning, whole, resilient, healthy landscapes.
If you want to talk about that, come talk to me.
Yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering, I was one with the book, but,
Finally, actually.
it's an easy one. How do you, like, pull the story out of the environmental rant? And then my second part of that question.
You want to know my secret?
Yeah, I do. It's how it like hooks people, and sometimes it's really, I think, I don't know, I don't have any trouble environmental ranting, but obviously we need to be able to engage our members better than that, so, yeah.
Well, think of how in a non-environmental, non-work setting, how do we interact with our friends, our parents, our relationships? It's generally with stories. What did you do today? Well, let me tell you. I think it's as simple as that. It's taking what we know as science or our rants and conveying that into a story format. Because ironically, despite our digital age, we are still genetically programmed to listen to stories. And so the craft is how to make this into a story. And we do it every day. Now the trick is, how do you actually do it for an environmental theme? That's the secret. There's no secret. Amy.
Yeah, so this is another one from the Zoom audience, from someone who's been a wildlife biologist for about 6 years. They ask, it has been frustrating to say the least to see these huge oil and gas companies get away with environmental murder. There are usually no significant repercussions to these companies, and a lot of the time they're able to work within the law or get an exception, or she says they're buddies with the DFO officers investigating them, so nothing ever happens. How can we be the change? How can we change legislation? For example, the Alberta Wildlife Act, which was designated around hunting, not the actual conservation of wildlife.
Well, I share your frustration. And I think that's, and I don't want to put this on the shoulders of the conservation specialists with the AWA or any other conservation organization, but that's one of the roles of conservation organizations, is to speak truth. Like Philip and others are doing on McClellan Lake. You know, to point out what incredible bullshit this is, that you can separate a big wetland complex like this with some sort of engineered structure and everything will be all right afterwards. What kind of madness is this? And it's the same thing with this, is all of these things need to see the light of day. And the reason that they are maintained is that no one talks about them in a public forum. And so the sense is, and you know, you hear successive Alberta politicians talk about what an exceptional environmental program we have in Alberta. Really, what part of that compared to Uruguay or Venezuela would this be? And so I think that's part of the answer, is this stuff has to have a light shone on it, because the bad stuff always hides in shadows, and light is a sanitizing substance. Yes, Rita.
I guess going back a little bit to the seatbelt thing. Sure, lots of people wear seatbelts just because they don't want to die in a crash. But plenty of people also do it because that's what they were told. That's what they've always done, or because other people. So what do you do when the evidence isn't enough?
Yield to their good nature. Well, I think the thing is that for some people, the evidence will never be enough.
Yeah.
The question is it enough for most people? Because we're not gonna convince everyone. I mean, I haven't even convinced all of you to rush over there and buy a book and advantage the AWA. But if most people do, and that's, I think, why seat belts are used, is most people think it's a good idea. Yes. Oh, you're gonna confront
I'm
me with
reading
something.
this book by this super optimistic guy. He said, there I was transported to a place of optimism, hope, and solution. John Rizika, you want to share that story?
Our friends Dawn and Marie Rizika. They're now retired. They own an organic farm east of Camrose, in eastern Canada. Primarily raising pasture-raised pork and pasture-raised poultry and custom grazing. And I grew up on a farm, and I've watched the progression of agriculture turn into agribusiness. And what that's meant is essentially big fields, no fence roads, no wetlands, very little biodiversity left, huge equipment with products that are drenched in diesel fuel, as well as other poisons. And here was a place, Dawn and Marie had been in that agribusiness mandate, and for a variety of reasons, mounting debt, health related issues, decided that this is not a sustainable future for us. And so they went to a holistic management course, and it turned them around. And as a consequence, you know, they found other ways of farming that made sense, that actually didn't bludgeon the earth into submission, but worked with the earth to create a sustainable agricultural product. The first time I went there, looking at the pigs in these big movable pens that were moved every couple of days to a new bit of pasture. I mean, I knew pigs couldn't fly, but the damn things were smiling. So they looked happy. And it struck me, this is another way to look at agriculture. Now, will it work for everybody? No. You know, will it feed everybody? No. Will it feed some people? Yes. And will it feed people in the local area? Yes. Unlike most of agribusiness, where all those commodities are exported. And so it really did fill me with a sense that, you know, there is hope in the world. Just a quick story, just for those of you that haven't read it. The first thing I thought about when I saw these big movable poultry pens that were moved every day, and watching the chickens and the turkeys attack new pasture and new grasshoppers, I said to Dawn, you leave these out overnight? He said, yeah. And I thought to myself, coyotes, how does he deal with coyotes? So I asked him, how do you deal with coyotes? Oh, he said, they don't really bother us. I said, I have some scarecrows and I change the clothing every 2 or 3 days. I spritz some of my son's aftershave lotion. He said, but most importantly, I leave a radio playing overnight because it's voices. 1 year after having got rid of the poultry, he had inadvertently left one of the radios playing in the field. He came back and coyotes had chewed the wire from the battery to the radio. And be damned if John couldn't remember if it was tuned to CBC or Christian rock. Anyways, it's a wonderful indication of what we could do, you know, to create these islands of sustainability in agricultural Alberta. Yes.
Yeah, just a positive note, because I look back at 50 years and say what would have happened if we hadn't been. And It's a lot worse than, so we just need more voices.
It's a lot worse because we were here. Sorry, my hearing's bad.
Yes, so we just need more voices. And they have to speak loudly, and we need diverse voices speaking loudly. So we shouldn't be so quick to say criticize Extinction Rebellion for their tactics. They feel the pain that we should be feeling. And also there's politicians that are trying to work the system. This is a very difficult system to work, so I understand that. And we need the involvement of more sociologists.
We do.
To find out ways that people can get motivated. And I do get motivated because I go to places where people are doing the hard work. And there's young people by the bazillions out there, and that's what keeps me going.
I feel so blessed to work with young people like the conservation specialists in this room. Because there's a passion there that I think to myself, it's gonna work. Someday it's gonna work. Yeah.
Back to planning, there are a lot of people that are good people, you know, some of my friends and acquaintances included, that really think there is some planning, or they have no idea how these things work. So I think something that would be very, very valuable for conservation groups would be to expose how things are done. Let's talk about logging. How do they log the eastern slopes? What's the process? What's the follow-up? How do hearings work? People don't know that Fish and Wildlife people can't attend it.
Or that most of the public can't.
Yeah, and I just think it would be very valuable to show people how the environment's handled. And as a pecking order, talk about that. You know, I used to go into meetings, interdepartmental meetings when I was very young, working for parks, and people would look at me as if I was nuts, you know, when I talk about non-game species. You know, we're talking about an oil well somewhere, you know. And yeah, things have changed, but not for the better.
Yeah, I used to have a biologist colleague that called them non-species.
Oh my. Well, we're still trying to get plains bison as a wild species.
I want to go back to seatbelts and buoys and Cliff's comment about kind of intergenerational we touched on it. So, you know, you're right, as an analog, we wear our seatbelts. And we think we're using that as kind of a metaphor for environmental protection, but you know, I'm not convinced that the kind of severely normal Albertan would wear seatbelts if the reason was it protects your grandkids and it makes no difference to you. So there's
maybe if it convinced them they couldn't have grandparents or grandchildren if they didn't wear seatbelts.
Maybe. I just think so many Albertans are kind of me here now type people. That we assess everything, and it goes to Cleve's questions like, why don't we plan? Well, because as Lorne has taught us time and time again, there is a consequence. And in Alberta, planning is looking for the win-win-win-win solution, but we know that that's not mathematically possible. And so anytime you or others talk about, if you want these industrial development trajectories, here are the consequences to water, air, and land wildlife, that's considered a non-solution. And so you have very shallow planning. And then your concept about, which I think is so, you know, we don't detect the trends for what they are, these small incremental things that happen every day. You know, maybe you call it Polly's ratchet or shifting baselines or whatever. But we, particularly the younger generation, which used to, I think, largely be raised by grandparents, had older people that could teach them about meaningful time and space. Or whatever term.
Another advocacy for old people.
Yes, yeah, well, and nowadays we don't have those kind of intergenerational families and allow young people to understand the magnitude of the dynamics that are changing and what's been lost. And perhaps there's a story there.
It may well be. I think the other thing, and this is something I don't have children, so I can't speak meaningfully on it. although I certainly cherish the children that I vicariously know from friends. But it perplexes me that if people understand the world that we're in, where we're headed with this world, some of the tipping points, some of the disastrous ends. If you've had children or you're contemplating having children, and you still persist in helping that trend, what does that tell you about loving your children? Because it's not providing a world that they're gonna find a really happy place in. Perplexing to me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Isn't part of that problem that if you don't know about it, you can't care about it? So the people, they go through their lives, they're immersed in the economy. They're immersed in the city. They're not aware of ecology, the natural world. And as you say, you know, the benchmark thing, it's all the same anyways, it's in that way forever except for maybe it's in. So how do you change that?
I think that there is an argument to be made with that, but on the other side of the coin, and this year's fire season, in terms of the publicity, the people linking it to climate change. The flood of 2013, the flooding downtown Calgary. It again, this is one of these other perplexing things is you mean people can't connect the dots, but something's happening. And maybe it isn't happening in their backyard, but it's happening in Alberta. It's happening all around Alberta, happening across the world. And if you're not reacting to that, you must be congenitally blind to what the world is. And I find it very difficult that everyone is in that category. Some, yes, but everyone? Yeah. I don't know, I guess I'm not a sociologist to be able to predict that.
I think things are happening at almost a subconscious level. And you need that almost groundswell.
Yeah.
But as you say, they're congenitally blind people, and many
yes,
they have a downtown Calgary.
And not all of them are in the legislature.
Some of the best skills.
I just, when I thought about the storytelling, I think one positive, shift that has been happening. And when I was a kid, you know, we learned about, well, that's a beaver, that's a muskrat, that's a deer, and I think what the shift that's happening now for younger people is that they're learning the indigenous names of those animals, and so, I can't pronounce Blackfoot word for the beaver, but it's, that it is a story, it's not just a word anymore, and so.
The word embodies.
Yeah, the word embodies the story, and the story is about the importance of watershed, and the importance of wisdom and water keepers, and so. Like, that shift might be a little point of optimism in the younger generation, because it does speak implicitly the importance of stewardship.
Sure. And we have to hold on to those points of optimism. Yes, Jim.
Carrying on in that sort of theme, the nature deficit disorder is certainly a factor in where we are right now. And there are a couple of reasons for optimism. One of them going back like 50 years when you and I were at university, only a small percentage of the people in biology, zoology were female. Dr. Post's class, I'm pretty sure the majority are female now. Second thing, when I was in
if women looked after the world, it would be done better.
Yeah.
This is what you're getting.
Politics and same pride as well. The second thing is, many trips that I've gotten out later in the last few years, I've been pleasantly surprised to notice that when you see kids going into the lake, some as young as age 3, most often it's the mother that's taking them in there. The children are learning to appreciate the outdoors, and what AWA and many of the people here do is to expose, mentor, young people, family members, children, grandchildren, and if you don't have children or grandchildren, you've got the opportunity to mentor other people's kids, expose them to it. That increases the number of people that are going to care about it, give a damn about it, and be willing to do something about it. So that's where I find some reasons for optimism, just by virtue of what I saw. And yes, there were about 200 cars parked on both sides of the highway near the Elbow Lake parking lot, which was jammed full 2 years ago. But a lot of those people that are going in there are exposing their kids to the environment, and they will have an appreciation for it, and they'll be willing to stand up for it.
As you've told me stories about the kids that you're mentoring, Jim. Well done.
If I can play the devil's advocate for just a minute, I'm not so sure it's as clear as drawing a line from one dock to the next.
Oh, no.
We've had floods in the past, we've had droughts in the past, we've had forest fires in the past. And I think humans are really poor at thinking about probabilities and making decisions based on things that are not clear, not black and white.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a big part of the problem is.
And we're also subject to optimism bias, where we think things are gonna work out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of our DNA since the time we evolved. The saber-toothed tiger is not going to get me. But sometimes it did.
All you need is one person to stand up and say, yes, we had droughts in the 1920s.
I know.
So what's the big deal about today?
Yeah.
So they can't draw that line into the future.
I can remember a colleague of mine standing up talking about drought in eastern Alberta and how stocking rates are gonna have to be cut back. And one old boy from the back said, well, I hear you, Bob, but what we really need is just a darn good rain. You know, that's the syndrome that we're up against. Yeah.
Besides, we got all these cattle in the woods and logging, so, you know, I'll take care of the fire.
Sure. Yes. And that logging is a preventative for fire.
Exactly.
All right.
Thank you very much. I just want to point out a couple of things. I like the idea of exposing, you know, how logging works and how hearings work. And maybe we'll do a whole wildlands advocate issue on how that works. I think that's a really good idea, so I'll take that into consideration and pass it on to Amy, who's now the editor of Wildlands Advocate, to take that decision forward. Yeah, underwear and jam aside, together or not together, there are a lot of other really great nuggets in that book. And I'm a prolific reader. I've been asked over the years to write lots of reviews of books, and many books I've chosen not to share my thoughts about. Because I was raised in an age where I was told if you don't have anything nice to say nothing at all. I wrote this review before I knew that Lorne would be coming here, and before he generously donated 40 books for tonight. You will never get a better price on this book. And you can get it signed tonight. So I would suggest that delve into some of those other nuggets that he has shared with us tonight and pass this book on to somebody else after you finish reading it. I will cherish mine. Where the topic came up tonight, and that was about motivation. And I know that in conservation organizations, we struggle with motivation. It's really hard. We can go down to our library here and pull out old issues of the wildlands advocate, talking about the same issues that we're talking about today, right? In the same places that we're talking about today, because 20, 50 years have gone by and subsequent governments will make a little change and then it gets changed back and then another change happens and we're still fighting that. It is really hard to motivate. I use ice cream for my staff, but you know, it's important that we look at other examples. And so every time, you know, it doesn't matter how busy my email folder is, every time Lorne sends me an article, I relish the opportunity to learn and experience something in a different manner. He has an eloquent way of pointing out things that seem really simple on the initial steps and then hitting you over the head at the end. But it motivates me. It motivates me to continue the work that I do, and I hope that it will motivate my staff to continue the excellent work that they're doing. So please buy a book. Christmas is coming.
You can add extra for the signature.
Yes, we can. And he didn't say he would sign them, but I'm sort of voluntold him that he's going to be signing them. I'm sure Lorne would do that. But I want to thank all of you for coming and your engagement tonight. You know, it's wonderful to come and listen to these beautiful stories and learn and share. But it's the communication around that makes it so special for all of us. And hopefully the people in virtual land that also got the experience. So thank you, Lorne, very much for coming. And thank you all for supporting AWA by being here tonight.